Good afternoon, and welcome to another Research in Action brought to you by the Division of Research at Florida Atlantic University. With that, it is my very great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Nicholas Baima. Dr. Baima has research interest in Plato's ethical theory, and what really struck my interest here is that Plato thought that ignorance and false belief can improve one's life. So with that, I'm just going to turn it over to Dr. Baima, who can tell us all about that theory.
Hey, welcome everyone. So today I'm going to talk about Plato. My goal is threefold. So first, I want to provide you with an overview of what philosophy is. I realize that not everyone has been exposed to philosophy or maybe even knows what it is, so I want everyone to come away with at least a general idea of what it involves. Second, I want you to come away with a broad understanding of what Plato's philosophy is about, some of the core ideas. He wrote many things, so we won't be able to talk about all of it, so just a few of the key ideas. And finally, I want you to understand what my research is about. Okay, so let's begin with an overview of philosophy. Well, so the name says it all. Well, what does philosophy mean etymologically? Well, it's made up of two Greek words, philos, which means love, and sophia, which means wisdom. So putting it together, philosophy is the love of wisdom. The problem is if we just say like, well, philosophy is the love of wisdom, that's far too general. At least it's far too general today. Because there's many ways one can be wise. There's many subjects that involve wisdom or knowledge of some sort. So just by way of example, we have science, art and literature, and religion. So although philosophy doesn't become separate from science until later, past Plato's time, we today can understand it as being different from science and art and religion. And so the question is how can we understand it to be different from these other subjects of knowledge? Well, I think one helpful way of approaching an answer to that question is to conceive of philosophy in three ways. So first, we can think about philosophy as being a method. Second, as involving particular subject matters. And finally, as an attitude. And I'll go through each of these in a little more detail. So philosophy as a method. We don't have time to contrast philosophy with all things. So let's just start with what is the difference between something like philosophy and science? Well, both scientists and philosophers make arguments. So what is the difference? Well, we're gonna have to be a little crude here, but science is going to be primarily empirical, and philosophy is going to be primarily conceptual. So here's an example. Anthropologists, sociologists, psychologists, and neuroscientists, they might all study ethics, each in their own way, but their approach is going to be primarily be descriptive and empirical. So, for instance, a psychologist might want to know how our moral emotions evolved, or what are moral emotions. Anthropologists and sociologists might look at how different ethical behaviors and laws of cultures. Neuroscientists, would study various chemicals involved in the moral emotions. Well, they're mostly trying to describe the way in which things are, and their approach is through a natural investigation of the world. You can contrast that with a normative ethicist whose approach is going to be primarily conceptual. So rather than trying to just describe the way the world is, they're going to try to say, how ought it be? So to help flesh this out, we can think about a thought experiment Plato came up with. This is called the Ring of Gyges, and it's in Plato's Republic. So thought experiments are a way to test intuitions. Plato's Republic, a book of Plato's, probably the most famous today, it asks two central questions. What is justice? And is it always better to be just than unjust? This second question is asking whether it's better for you in your life in terms of your own happiness and well-being to be just than unjust. So the Ring of Gyges thought experiment is a way of examining question 2. So some of you have probably seen The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit. There's a ring in that story that gives you the power of invisibility. Well, that's what the Ring of Gyges is. It gives you the power of invisibility. What invisibility allows one to do is to commit injustice or wrongs and to escape punishment. And so the question is if you had the ability to do things that were wrong, would that be in your own self-interest? So would it ever be in your own self-interest to steal or something or lie? Now, if you choose to commit injustice or wrong with the ring, then it would seem that it isn't always better to be just than unjust. So I bring this up not to say anything about justice or anything like that, but to give you an example of the kind of methodology of a philosopher. And you can contrast this with like an actual physical experiment of a scientist. So that's one. We can think about philosophy as a method, but we can also think about philosophy as a subject matter. You can think that there are 3 core subjects that philosophy examines: metaphysics, which examines the nature of reality; epistemology, what is knowledge, what qualifies as good evidence for a belief; and finally, ethics, which we just kind of talked about, what is right and wrong, what is a good human life. You also have subjects like philosophy of X, so for instance, philosophy of science or philosophy of mind. And these kind of explore the other 3 subjects we just discussed on a particular area, so like say the mind. And then we have history of philosophy, which I'm talking about today, like ancient Greek philosophy or ancient Chinese philosophy. Finally, our third way of conceiving of philosophy is that philosophy is an attitude. And this is a quote from Bertrand Russell. He says, "Philosophy is to be studied not for the sake of any definite answers to its questions, since no definite answer can, as a rule, be known to be true, but rather for the sake of the questions themselves, because these questions enlarge our intellectual imagination and diminish dogmatic assurance, which closes the mind against speculation, but above all because through the greatness of the universe which philosophy contemplates, the mind also is rendered great." So just to recap, philosophy might be conceived of as involving a particular conceptual methodology, a particular subject matter, metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, and a reflective attitude, which encompasses the desire to challenge underlying assumptions and to seek out a bigger picture of the universe and one's place in it. So why do I study Plato and not some other philosopher? Well, Plato is wonderful because all 3 aspects of philosophy are found in his work in almost every single dialogue. So let's think about Plato on philosophy. So first, like we just talked about the thought experiment. That's a tool that Plato helps develop or at least codify through his examples. And so we still use thought experiments today. He develops the method of hypothesis, which is later on gets used in science. And he develops Socratic teaching, which is a teaching method used today. And so he adopts conceptual methods that we use today in various fields. He's a systematic philosopher. When he's doing ethics and epistemology and metaphysics, they're all done together, right? So his ethics is always going to be how one should live relates to the nature of reality and what is knowledge. And finally, he says, I love this quote. This is from the Theaetetus. He says, "Philosophy begins in wonder," right? So that captures the notion that philosophy is about expanding one's mind, and it's a reflective thing. So with that, let's turn to an overview of Plato's philosophy. Okay, so Plato is alive during the classical period. He's an Athenian, a Greek, and he's one of the world's best known and most widely read philosophers. He was a student of Socrates and a teacher of Aristotle, two of the greatest philosophers the world has ever known. He wrote philosophical dialogues, which are considered not only great works of philosophy, but literature as well. In most of the dialogues, Socrates is the main character. Now, I want to make a note about this. So the character Socrates in the dialogues, there is a historical Socrates, and Plato's Socrates bears some relationship to the historical Socrates. But when you read the dialogues, my recommendation is not to treat them as like a true historical account, but rather it provides us with a rough image of the things that Socrates was interested in, and Plato's using it as a tool to further discussion on important ideas. So I think this is a great quote that captures some of the importance of Plato. This is Alfred North Whitehead. He says, "The safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato." Okay, so I'm not going to touch on each of these in detail, but I just want to talk about some of the broader influence or where you see Plato's ideas in culture today. So the idea of a university. Well, Plato, he created a school in Athens called the Academy, essentially like an institution for higher learning. It wasn't like you got degrees like we do at FAU, but you might think that the notion of a university does in some way originate or stem from Plato's academy. The idea of some of the ideas in Christianity. Okay, so two Christian philosophers and theologians, Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, right, of the medieval ages. Augustine, you can think about him as being a Platonist, right? So he's taking some of Plato's ideas and then he's connecting them to Christianity. And Aquinas, you can think of him as an Aristotelian, and he's taking some of Aristotle's ideas and combining them with Christianity. And so we see that, Aristotle's Plato's student. So Christianity, some of the ideas of Plato and Aristotle kind of get funneled into it. The notion of Platonic love, Plato didn't invent that idea, but right, that's not like his term. That's a term we use to describe an idea expressed in his symposium. The Socratic teaching method, which we'll talk about soon. And then also, there's lots of artwork involving Socrates. The artwork is usually based upon Plato's dialogues. And besides the artwork, it gives us a window into who Socrates was. Because Socrates didn't actually write anything down. He just went around and talked to people. And one of the unfortunate things that happens to Socrates and has a big impact on Plato's life is that Socrates is unjustly put to death. And most of Plato's work, or a lot of it, tries to grapple with that. And so I'll turn to another influence after this. So this is kind of cool. So this is from Plato's Timaeus. So the myth of Atlantis, the underwater lost city, that's in Plato's Timaeus. And this is from Johannes Kepler, the astronomer, and he's trying to understand the world with respect to, this is actually geometric shapes and their physical relationship expressed in the Timaeus. So we actually see some of Plato's ideas in science and in myth. What I want to talk about now is I'm going to talk about two key Platonic ideas in detail, the Socratic method and the cave. So Socratic wisdom, I don't know if anyone's ever heard that notion, but Socratic wisdom is the idea that you are aware of your own ignorance. Socrates said that he was wise, or he discovered that he was wise, in that, unlike other people, he was aware that he knew nothing important. So he knew like simple things, but anything of great significance he was ignorant of. And so connected to this idea of Socratic wisdom is self-knowledge. To be wise is to understand yourself. Now Socrates' method was to go around and to talk to people. This is called the elenchus, or the cross-examination. And how it works is you would go around and, if someone said, so he would go around and he'd ask someone like, do you know what courage is? And they would say, yes, courage is the resistance to fear. And then they'd give an example. And then Socrates would say, well, what if someone resists fear but is foolish? Are they still courageous? And then he would engage them in these back and forth conversations. And his methodology was mostly asking them questions as opposed to proposing answers. So this is tied to the Socratic method of teaching today, which involves encouraging critical thinking through dialogue, asking questions, right, as opposed to merely telling someone an answer. Well, Socrates refers to this methodology as him being a gadfly. He thought he was stinging his Athenian neighbors out of their intellectual laziness. This is tied to the idea that the unexamined life is not worth living. So through being a gadfly and annoying his neighbors with these questions, he was trying to get them to reflect on their life and to see whether or not the things that they were doing were actually good. Well, interestingly enough, Martin Luther King Jr., he adopts this gadfly method in the letter from the Birmingham jail. So speaking about nonviolent direct action, he says this: just as Socrates felt that it was necessary to create a tension in the mind so that individuals could rise from the bondage of myths and half-truths to the unfettered realm of creative analysis and objective appraisals, so must we see the need for nonviolent gadflies to create the tension in society that will help men rise from the dark depths of prejudice and racism to the majestic heights of understanding and brotherhood. So Martin Luther King saw this gadfly method as a way of getting people out of like their biases and prejudices and getting them to reflect on whether or not these things are good. Now, there's other connections with Martin Luther King Jr. and Socrates. I don't have time to spend on them, but I will say this. When asked if he could take any book other than the Bible, on the desert island, what book would that be? And Martin Luther King Jr. said Plato's Republic, because it pretty much had all the great ideas in life that you would need. So with that, let's turn to the Republic, and I want to talk about the cave. The allegory of the cave essentially is a way of getting us to think about the difference between appearance and reality. And this theme is seen in many different movies and books. Probably the one that's most well known is The Matrix. Like perhaps, although things seem real to you now, you could be living in a simulation. In fact, you wouldn't know the difference. So this is kind of the idea in the allegory of the cave. So let's turn to that. So we have this image here of a cave. This is in Plato's Republic, and he asks us to imagine that there's chained prisoners staring at a wall in front of them. So you have these chained prisoners here, right? They're looking at the wall in front of them. Since they have never seen anything different, they think that what they see is real, but it is mere shadows being created by someone behind them, illuminated by fire. So they just see the shadows and they think that the shadows are real objects because that's all they've seen their whole life. But it turns out that behind them is the real object and they're just completely unaware of that. Now, Plato asks us, he says, like, imagine what would happen if we released one of those prisoners and compelled them to go outside the cave. At first, the prisoner would be dizzy and confused. He would be in he'd probably have like a immense headache being in a cave and just seeing the brightness of the sun. He would be confused about what he's seeing. He probably would be doubting what he's seeing. However, once their eyes adjusted, they would realize that what they saw before was a mere shadow of reality, and they would never want to return to the cave. So once they got outside this cave, they realized that their life before was really fake, and that what where they want to be is with reality and truth. Then finally, Plato asks us, well, what would happen if we compelled that person to return to the cave? And he says this, and before his eyes had recovered, if he had to compete again with the perpetual prisoners in recognizing shadows, wouldn't he invite ridicule? And as for anyone who tried to free them and lead them upward, if they could somehow get their hands on him, wouldn't they kill him? They certainly would. So this seems to be somewhat of a reference to Socrates, who is unjustly convicted, who is trying to inspire his citizens to think more deeply about their lives and to show them that the values they had weren't really all that important, like material wealth. There's things more important than it. And they convicted him and killed him. And so that's what would happen if you the problem with the people within the cave is because they've never seen anything different. They're not able to recognize that this person who's bringing truth down to them is actually speaking the truth. So what does this mean? What does the cave mean? Well, I really hope that this talk inspires you to go read it or reread it, and then you think about it yourself. But if I had to say, like, what are some lessons people have taken from it, we might start with that there's a division between the sensible realm and the intelligible realm. And this is maybe the influence here on St. Augustine, that we can think about the cave as being the material world, or the world that we access through our senses, and outside the cave as being this higher reality that we only access through our mind. And he's saying that the higher reality, the intelligible realm, the realm not of the physical body, but of the soul, that is the real realm, right? So you might take that to be one lesson. Additionally, we see a connection between reality, truth, and value. The connection is that in the cave, the prisoners, they merely have illusions and their life isn't going well. Whereas the people outside the cave have truth and knowledge and their lives are going well. Now, what's interesting about this is that this is a denial of a subjective conception of well-being. So what I mean by well-being is, like, think about success, happiness, flourishing, all of the above. Some people think today, and it's not unreasonable, that what it is to live well is to satisfy your desires or to think that you're doing well. That's really all happiness amounts to be. And Socrates is trying to challenge that with this image, because the people in the cave aren't actually doing well, right? They're just unaware that their life isn't going good. Additionally, the image suggests that education is revolutionary. It expands one's mind in a new way, right? So I don't mean like a formal education. It's more of just like an open-minded reflectiveness towards the world. It reorients oneself to the world. Once one opens one's minds, one won't be the same person. This again ties to this idea of Socratic teaching, where teaching isn't just about giving information, it's about inspiring. Finally, it promotes a kind of skepticism that we should be maybe, we don't need to be radical skeptics and think that we're in the matrix, but we should be skeptical of the values that people, the things people like around us. We should ask ourselves if they're actually good. Okay, so with this cave and the gadfly image, I want to turn to my research because those will help make sense of what I do. So I'm interested in two key research questions. The historical question is, what does Plato think the relationship between well-being, virtue, and truth is? The philosophical question is, what is the relationship between well-being, virtue, and truth? So the historical question is what does Plato think about these things? The philosophical question is like, what is the relationship between these things? Now here's a traditional answer to the historical question. Traditionally, it's thought that Plato believes that in order to live well, one must be virtuous. And in order to be virtuous, one must have knowledge and truth. So essentially that means that no vicious person is doing well. So if we return to the image of the ring, right? If you use the ring to commit murder, then Plato's going to say, you're not doing well, even if you think you are. And the reason is because you're vicious, and in order to live well, you must be virtuous. Now, being virtuous isn't just, according to the traditional view, it's not simply doing the right thing, it's doing the right thing for the right reason and understanding why it's the right reason. So what this would mean is that the ignorant, like think of the people in the cave, they cannot flourish or live well until they escape their ignorance. So on the traditional reading, it's really only the people outside the cave, or at least those who have been outside the cave, who are doing well. So I just wrote a new book called Plato's Pragmatism with my good friend Tyler Paitis of Australian Catholic University. And in this book, we challenge this traditional view. So I just want to be clear, I do think there's an element of truth to the traditional view. So when I push back, it's not like anything goes and you're living well, but there's more to the story. And so on my view, Plato believes that all humans require some false beliefs and epistemic vice in order to live well. So what is epistemic vice? Well, that means that in order to live well, sometimes you'll have to believe without good reason. And I'll get to some examples where that might be true. Plato believes that the pursuit of truth can conflict with virtue and well-being. So if someone is just interested in truth, then they can't live well on Plato's view. So living well involves various trade-offs between pursuing truth, being virtuous, and happiness. When truth and well-being come into conflict, priority should be given to virtue and well-being over truth. Okay, what is the significance of my research? Well, if I'm right about this, then we have to rethink Plato's position with respect to the human condition. So Plato is sometimes viewed as an intellectual elitist, overdoing rationality and denouncing the world for a higher life. One reason why you might consider him an intellectual elitist is if you think about the cave image again. if escaping the cage, if escaping the cave, not the cage, is only possible for philosophers who are reflecting all day, and escaping the cave is like the only way to have a good life, then it looks like only the philosophers are living a good life. Well, that means like the vast majority of people aren't doing well. So you could see the kind of snobbery of that view. And also, right, you might think that it's an overemphasis on rationality. And if you understand the escape of the cave as this intelligible realm breaking away from the world of senses and matter, then there's a way of reading what he's saying is he's denouncing the world for a higher or like otherworldly existence. Now, if I'm right about this, then there's several qualifications to Plato we have to take into account, right? So I still think Plato ends up being an elitist, maybe just of a different sort, and his view of the average human is much better than on the traditional reading. So non-rational aspects of psychology, such as emotions, on my reading, play a far more significant role in Plato's philosophy. There's also just a general notion of human frailty that runs through my reading of Plato. I think that his view is that one way in which we are different from the gods is that our life does involve various compromises. And that's okay because that's part of the human condition. And finally, I think that he's a practically minded philosopher. So it would be wrong to say that he is only focused on the intelligible world and that he ignores sensible things. Okay, so that's an overview of my research. I want to talk about the philosophical question, but in the context of talking about the philosophical question, I'll tie it back to Plato so you can see maybe where there's evidence of my reading. So in Plato's pragmatism, I argue that Plato saw a tension between the pursuit of truth and living well. Now we might think about this question independently of Plato. We might just ask like, where in society today could this tension exist? And I want to provide two examples. I'm not making any strong statement about these examples. These are merely just to demonstrate where this tension could exist today. So one example might be social media and censorship. And the second might be a kind of religious faith, or if you don't want to talk about religion, you could consider yourself like faith in yourself. So let's begin with one, social media, censorship, and openness. Part of the Socratic mission seems to be to follow the argument wherever it goes and to examine all topics. You could think about that, you could associate that with the gadfly approach, right? The approach that Martin Luther King Jr. really liked because it was a way to uncover systematic bias, right? It's only through challenging ideas and conventions that we can make progress. So that's like the good side of the gadfly approach. However, in Plato's Republic, the political system put forth is highly censored and includes propaganda. Additionally, only few citizens will practice philosophy in the Republic. So we see a tension here. The tension is, on the one hand, the gadfly approach is like talk to everyone, challenge all topics, get at the truth. Whereas in the Republic, it's more like, well, we don't want everyone doing that. And the question is why doesn't he want everyone doing that in the Republic? And the idea seems to be that, well, one, not everyone's good at it. And a consequence of that would be like, people might have the right answer and they might like question themselves out of it. Two, he thinks that the answers that will be popular might not be right. They might be the sexy, cool, hip kind of answers, right? And so people will not necessarily be drawn to truth. So here's how we could understand it today. While Plato was too liberal in its use or his use of authoritative deception, he was correct in holding that the proper approach to communicating multifaceted information across a range of people is far more complex than a simple maxim of exceptionalist veracity. Observance of the effects of social media and ratings-driven news broadcasts undoubtedly support Plato's general concern that careless and unregulated communication can lead to demagoguery and divisiveness. Plato's question of how to balance honesty and openness with the preservation of epistemic authority, objective values, and psychological health is very much the question of our day. So I present this to you not to suggest an answer, but I present this to you to suggest that the issue that Plato was wrestling with, right? We value truth and we value honesty and openness. We also value, having epistemic authority, such as like physicians, objective values, and psychological health. And how do we balance these various competing goods? Okay, the second issue I want to talk about is religious faith and evidence. So W.K. Clifford was a mathematician philosopher, and he argued that we ought never to form beliefs without sufficient evidence. And he gives this ship example. So imagine that there was an owner of a ship who rents out his ship for people to sail. And the owner of the ship knows, like he assesses the ship and he's like, oh, this ship has like some problems that need to be fixed. But then he thinks like the ship has succeeded in the past. And so it'll probably succeed in the future. So Clifford said he like puts his faith in Providence and he rents the ship out to another person because he believes beyond the evidence that the ship will do well. He has kind of faith in it. And what happens is that the ship sinks mid-ocean, and Clifford says like his problem was that he believed without sufficient evidence. Now, Clifford doesn't come out and say this, but he's directing this at religious faith generally. I don't think he could say this comfortably during his time. He actually directs it at Islam as an example, but I think he meant it generally as religious faith generally. And he's saying religious faith is kind of like the ship, and it's dangerous in that it could lead to a sinking in the future. Now, in contrast, you can think about William James, the philosopher, as proposing the alternative perspective. And his perspective is that under certain conditions, we can believe beyond the evidence. So he's not saying, just to be clear, he's not saying you can believe whatever you want, nor is he saying you can believe against the evidence. He's just saying in some conditions, you can believe beyond the evidence. And for some people in some situations, he thinks that it's perfectly appropriate to have a religious faith that goes beyond the evidence. So we can think about the traditional view and my view with respect to these two philosophers. At least I think that's a useful illustration. So the traditional view of Plato is going to say that Plato is more like Clifford. And the view I'm trying to propose is his view, he is more like James. Okay, so here's an example of why he might be more like James. So we talked a little bit about the Republic. Plato's Republic, again, asks two questions. What is justice? And is it always better to be just than unjust? Now, pretty much book one sets it up. And then books 2 through 9 give what you might consider rational arguments for why it's better to be just than unjust. Book 10 ends with a return to a discussion of poetry that occurred earlier, and then it ends with this myth, and I'll read this myth. It's one of my favorite lines in the whole Republic. And so Glaucon, his story was saved and not lost. And it would save us too if we were persuaded by it, since we would safely cross the river of forgetfulness with our souls undefiled. But if we are persuaded by me, we believe that the soul is immortal and able to endure every evil and every good, and always hold to the upward path, practicing justice with wisdom every way we can, so that we'll be friends to ourselves and to the gods, both while we remain here on earth and when we receive the rewards of justice and go around like victors in the games collecting prizes. And so both in this life and the 1,000-year journey we have described, we shall fare well. So what he's giving a reincarnation myth in which the wise and the just are able to always live good lives, no matter, like, so they're the only ones that are able to escape a cycle of reincarnation. The details of the myth aren't so important. What I think is interesting is just why end on a myth? Now, there could be literary reasons, but I'd like to think that the reasons he's suggesting is that he sees there being a non-rational, an emotional, or a spiritual element to life that helps one be virtuous. So just to put the tension, so on the one hand, Plato wants us to impartially seek out the truth and to only hold beliefs on the basis of sound evidence. But on the other hand, he seems willing to support certain philosophical positions through non-rational means. And what my research does is try to make sense of that. Okay, so I want to recap briefly. So what I did is I discussed philosophy, what it is. I explained it that it could be understood as a method, a subject matter, or an attitude. Then I talked about some areas of Plato's philosophy. And in particular, I focused on the Socratic method and the idea of the gadfly. And we saw the influence of that in Martin Luther King Jr.'s thinking. And then we talked about the cave. Then using those two ideas, we transitioned to my research of Plato's pragmatism. And the thesis of my research is that truth, well-being, and virtue can conflict in Plato's work. And when they conflict, virtue and well-being should be given priority. So the practical is given priority over the theoretical. All right, so that's what I got for you.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. Very interesting. I'm actually going to start a question related to your cave example. So there's the assumption being made that the people in the cave have a poorer life than those outside of the cave. They just don't know it because they haven't seen anything outside the cave. But who decides that the outside people actually do have indeed a better life? It's a definition of what a good life is, right? And it's being solely made, it seems, by the outside people in this case. And also the outside people, as they're exiting the cave or living outside the cave, are they just expanding on the cave? They're making the cave bigger, but it's still a cave. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think that's a wonderful question, and it cuts to the heart of Plato's philosophy. I guess I'll maybe speak from more of the traditional perspective because yeah, I'll just talk because it might help provide just an overview of how Plato thinks about these things. But so Plato tries to address this question in a number of ways throughout his works. And one of the questions is just like, does well-being, or the Greek word eudaimonia, success, happiness, whatever, does it amount to more than a subjective feeling or satisfying any desire? And so one way to think about that is let's just do a thought experiment. This captures some of Plato's ideas, but so this isn't his idea. But imagine you were in a romantic relationship and you thought it, from your perspective, it was going wonderful. But unbeknownst to you, you're being deceived and your partner's cheating on you, and they actually are very disrespectful when they speak about you. If your reaction to that thought experiment is that your relationship isn't going well, then that might suggest that there's objective standards for wellness that extend beyond what you merely think. And that's how Plato's thinking about it. So the people in the cave are akin to those who think that the relationship is going well, but in fact it's not. Philosophy is never definitive, so one is always welcome to respond, right? And that's why I think it's a wonderful thing to study.
Very interesting. Just as a reminder, if you have a question, please hover over the Q&A button in the bottom of your screen and type your question there. We will try to go through as many questions as we can. If we don't make it through all of them, I will ask Nicholas to answer them offline. We will post them on our website then. Okay, so here's the next question, also related to the cave, and it's similar in nature. So are all of us just riding on the bus, so to speak, in our comfortable cultural default positions? Are we no better than Plato's people in the cave? We live and love our false consciousness?
Yeah, so I mean, look, one reading of Plato is going to say that most of us just are not doing well. Very few of us, if any, are doing well. My reading, I think that we can be doing well even if we're not fully aware of intellectual truths. And I think the reason why I think Plato holds that view is because he repeats again and again in the Republic that he wants everyone to have a share of well-being or happiness. He doesn't want anyone, he unfortunately divides society up into classes, but he doesn't want any one class to be doing like well and all the others suffering. And so I think like we have to infer that like the non-philosophers in a society are akin to something like in the cave, but he still thinks that they're capable of doing well. And what that should suggest to me is there might be better and worse caves. So putting that more in everyday language is like, even though we might be led by illusions, there could be better and worse illusions or fictions or myths. So the question isn't about getting rid of myths, it's about finding the right ones.
Coming to your example on the censorship. So we, at least officially, value truth and openness. And it is an interesting idea that's being brought up here that just by limiting the ideas and only sharing certain ideas wherever it is in media or wherever, can we trust that as truth? You know, that is a form of censorship then as well.
Yeah, so I think that cuts to the heart of it, and I think that there's many ways to think about it. I don't know what the right way is, but I think the contrast between Socrates and the Republic captures the conflict well, right? So Socrates, he wants to talk to anyone. I think he talked to people that would be maybe akin to an internet troll today, right? He saw value in that. But in Plato's Republic, it seems to suggest that there isn't much value in talking to those people and that they can actually be a great harm to society. I don't know what the right answer is. I mean, maybe that's why I do history of philosophy, so I don't have to give people an answer, but I just merely present the tension.
Yeah, it's very interesting, certainly, to talk about, I think. So,
Yeah.
very interesting thought process. So, coming back to the teaching philosophies of Plato, that one of the questions here is, does Stoicism fall under Plato's teachings?
The Stoicism?
Hmm.
Yeah, so Stoicism is definitely going to be drawn from some of Plato's core ideas. It's going to be difficult, though, to tease apart the influence of Socrates. So you might think that there's two past people that are really important to Stoicism. So that's Socrates and Diogenes the Cynic. And so some of Socrates, what they have though, comes from Plato's work. So Plato is definitely there. And it's also that Zeno, the founder of the Stoic school, he studied at Plato's academy for a little bit. So the influence of Plato on Stoicism is definitely there.
Great, thank you. Okay, a very complex question. So, from our attendees' understanding that many different schools of Greek and Roman philosophers were almost cult-like in their observance to the gods. What relationship did Plato himself have with the gods, and does his followers, or do his followers after him, change those views, and how are these views tied into the pursuit of truth and justice?
Yeah, so I think we see the tension here in this discussion. So there's ways of teaching Plato and Socrates in which they're incredibly just secular philosophers who are atheist or agnostic, and they do their philosophy without any reference to the gods. I actually think that I think there's an element to truth to that, and I don't want to say it's outright wrong. I would just say though, I think Plato saw religion as done well, it having a positive role in society in a way that a kind of atheistic society might not in general go well, right, for him. So I think that Plato did believe that there were gods. What the gods amount to being aren't going to be like Zeus and like those kind of people. Those are mere allegories. But I think that he does think that there are gods. Now, Plato also believes that there's forms. So you have a material reality. So I have my like table, I have my pencil, and then for certain objects, there's immaterial things. They're not tied. So there's an idea or concept of a pencil and table, and the idea and the concept are more real than the material ones. And so then there's a question about what is the relationship between the forms and the gods? Like, are the gods just forms? I think it's really unclear, but I will say this. Plato thought that you could do ethics, like reflect on ethics without reference to any divine text. So he thought you could use your reason to figure out what was right and wrong. So that's kind of the truth of the secular element. But I also think he is a religious philosopher, but not the sort of religion that was common during his time.
Very interesting. I will finish us off here with one more question. Just as a reminder, if you have any question, please drop it into the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will ask our speaker to answer all remaining questions offline. We will post the answers on our website, FAU Research in Action. Okay, here's the last question, Nicholas. In a world that craves new experiences, and thinking about the cave prisoners, do you think that Plato would identify with T.S. Eliot's lament, "We had the experience but missed the meaning"?
Oh, possibly. Yeah. I mean, yeah, that sounds right. Yeah, that there was like there's maybe a deeper truth to it that you didn't get. Yeah, that seems right.
It is just a guess, right?
Yeah, yeah. It's just I'd have to think more about it.
Yeah, at this
Um,
point, we can't really do anything else. Okay, I'll have one more question. Let's see. Did Plato advocate for thinking for oneself?
Yeah, I would say 100%. So there's look, I should have been clear about this. Like what Plato's exact position is very unclear because he wrote in dialogues um, where he's not in them, right? So instead of just saying what he thinks, he has a story, and so we don't know what he thinks. And I think that that's important. He wants us as readers to be reflecting on the text and asking ourselves, what does this mean? What would it have meant to him and what does it mean to me? So 100%, I think he wants you to think for yourself. I do think that he's worried about a society where everyone is challenging every idea, though, because I think he thinks that such a society, um, he thinks that pursuing whatever desire you have at any given moment will be disastrous. And I think that he saw his own democratic society as doing that. He saw it as kind of pretty much everyone do whatever you want. And he thought, that it just led to kind of greed and a concern for material things that are insignificant.
Very interesting. Thank you very much, Nicholas. We do have some remaining questions that we will ask you to answer offline, and we will post them again on our website together with a recording of today's presentation. Thank you again. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Very interesting topic. Hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye.
Bye.